One of the knights beside him frowned and warned him to mind his manners, but Ghislain ignored the comment entirely. He walked among his assembled knights, his armor gleaming faintly in the moonlight, and spoke in a steady, commanding tone. He told them that from this point on, they would descend directly into the middle of the enemy camp. Following their training, they were to infiltrate the walls, seize control of the interior, and then open the outer gate to let the Ghilean cavalry in. That was the core of the operation. He looked around at his men and reminded them that the cavalry army was the best armed force in the north. Even though the enemies had begun to learn mana, they would not be easy to face. Moreover, he warned that the foes they would encounter in the future would be far stronger than Cavalli's men. If they could not handle a battle of this level, they would have no future. Seeing hesitation in some of their faces, Ghislain raised his voice and reminded them of their past victories, how they had broken through the beastwood that no one had ever conquered, and how they had turned a hopeless war into triumph. His tone grew stronger as he asked them if their preparations had been lacking. The soldiers shouted back in unison that they had not. He then asked if they were afraid, and once again they roared back that they were not afraid. A proud smile formed beneath Ghislain's helmet as he told them that they had grown faster than anyone could have imagined. Then, as the massive balloons began to glow softly from the fires lit beneath them, Ghislain raised his sword high and gave the order to fly. Meanwhile, at the cavalry's castle, one of the soldiers standing guard on the wall peered through a telescope and commented that the enemy had spent the entire day digging and now seemed to be doing nothing. Another soldier yawned, saying that they were probably sleeping. 2 more soldiers arrived to relieve them for the shift change and asked if everything was fine. The man with the telescope sighed, saying he wasn't even sure how many days had passed and wondered aloud whether the Fenris army even planned to attack at all. The other 2 soldiers stretched and began to leave, relieved that it was finally time to rest. But suddenly, one of them noticed something strange in the sky. Seeing several round shapes approaching, he asked his comrade what they were. The other soldier squinted at the sight, wondering if it might be a monster. Before they could react, Ghislain leapt down from above and, in a single motion, cut one of them in half. He then swiftly killed the second soldier as well. One after another, the Fenris forces descended from the air balloons. Ghislain took command at the front line once more, shouting to his troops to kill every last enemy they encountered. Several knights were seen walking toward Count Cavalli's chamber that night. Among them was Lisi, the commander of the Cavalli Knights Order. The guards stationed outside the Count's bedroom were taken aback to see the knight commander arriving so late. When Lisi inquired about the Count's condition, one of the guards hastily informed him that the Lord was still asleep. Without hesitation, Lisi entered the Count's room. The sudden intrusion startled Count Cavalli awake. Seeing Lisi, he demanded to know what was happening. Addressing him formally as Lord, Lisi reported that an emergency had arisen. The enemy had breached the castle walls. Upon hearing this, Count Cavalli's expression turned pale. In disbelief, he repeated the words, struggling to accept that the fortress had been infiltrated. Outside, air balloons continued to descend one after another, delivering waves of Fenris troops into the castle grounds. Ghislain and his comrades began slaughtering the defenders stationed along the walls. Filled with bloodlust, Kay shouted to his men to advance and tear off the last remnant of pride from the rump-faced lord. The deafening sounds of battle, clashing steel, dying screams, and panicked cries soon echoed through the corridors and reached the Count's chamber. Terror washed over Count Cavalli's face as he demanded to know how the Fenris soldiers had managed to get over the walls and whether the tunnels had been compromised. Lisi replied that, according to reports from the soldiers, the attackers had ridden some kind of unidentified flying spheres through the sky. The Count gasped in disbelief, struggling to comprehend what he was hearing. Lisi, grim and resolute, stated that the means of their entry no longer mattered. Their momentum was overwhelming, and they were rapidly seizing control of the castle. Urgently, he urged his lord to move at once. Lisi then outlined his plan. He would head straight for the underground passage near the outer wall to hold the gate. If they succeeded, they could summon the main force stationed at the south gate and trap the invading troops from both sides. For a brief moment, Count Cavalli stood frozen as the weight of the situation sank in. His hands trembled, and his voice quivered as he lamented that even though they had set traps to counter the Fenris tunnels, he had still fallen for their decoy. Dread settled on his face as he muttered to himself about the fortress, the stronghold that had never once fallen, and whether the proud cavalry line would end with him. Lisi grasped the Count's shoulders, shaking him back to his senses. He implored his lord to escape through the secret passage with his retainers and seek reinforcements, promising to stay behind and defend the castle. He added that if the situation failed to improve, the Count must bring that man to their aid. Outside, the chaos among the cavalry soldiers had reached its peak. Shouts of confusion erupted as they wondered how the Fenris troops had managed to infiltrate the castle. Ghislain continued cutting them down effortlessly, his sword cleaving through their ranks as though they were made of paper. One soldier charged at him, only to be sliced cleanly in half before he could even cry out. Witnessing such carnage, the others froze in terror. A desperate voice among them urged the troops to pull themselves together and fire their crossbows, reminding them that the enemy was few in number. But before they could act, another soldier screamed for them to look up. A moment later, one of the air balloons came crashing down directly onto the cavalry ranks, erupting in a violent explosion that sent dirt, debris, and bodies flying through the air. Apparently, Gordon and Alfoy had been aboard that balloon. As the smoke thickened around them, Alfoy, coughing harshly, shouted angrily at Gordon that he was a stupid muscle pig, and that he had already told him not to ride along because his weight was too much. Gordon, still trying to catch his breath, only glared at him in silence. As they both struggled to stand, a group of cavalry soldiers suddenly charged toward them. Before their blades could reach the two men, Ghislain appeared out of nowhere and swiftly eliminated the attackers. He immediately asked whether the two were hurt. Keir, watching, smirked and remarked mockingly that even as a knight, Gordon still acted the same as always. Gordon, however, remained silent, his face grim. Suddenly, Ghislain and Belinda caught sight of movement in the distance. Beyond the wall, the cavalry soldiers had already seized control of the gate. CA, seeing this, was taken aback, realizing that the enemy had already assumed a defensive formation. Ghislain calmly noted that their reaction was faster than expected, and reasoned that there must be someone sharp among their ranks directing them. He warned that the enemy forces they had scattered with the tunnel operation would soon regroup and that they needed to move quickly. Turning to his knights, Ghislain asked if everyone was ready. All of them responded in unison that they were. Without hesitation, Ghislain issued his orders. He instructed Keir to stop the soldiers on the walls and destroy all siege engines, while Belinda was tasked with finding Count Cavalli. Ghislain himself would clear a path toward the gate. In a firm and serious tone, he asked again if they were ready. The knights raised their swords high, and a powerful aura enveloped them as they shouted that they were prepared. A faint smile crossed Ghislain's lips as he placed his helmet on. Then, in a commanding voice, he gave the order for the Fenris Order of Knights to begin their action. A tense stillness settled across the battlefield as both sides prepared for the inevitable clash. Moments later, one of the cavalry soldiers rushed to the knight commander, reporting in alarm that the Fenris troops were advancing. Lisi immediately realized that their true objective had always been the gate. He ordered his men to ready their spears. As the Fenris knights charged forward, Lisi commanded his troops to hold their ground until reinforcements from the south gate arrived. The battle erupted with an earth-shaking roar. Ghislain and his knights unleashed a brutal assault, slaughtering the cavalry forces in a one-sided massacre. The knight commander watched in disbelief as his troops were torn apart without mercy. His eyes focused particularly on Ghislain, whose every swing of the sword cleaved through men as though they were paper. Panic spread among the soldiers as they realized there was no way to stop the attackers, whose weapons were all infused with mana. Lisi was stunned to see that every intruder was a knight, something he considered impossible. No matter how skilled they were, he thought, they should not have been able to break through a heavy infantry line so quickly. Resolving himself, he declared that the man leading the charge had to be stopped at all costs. Another soldier soon reported that the momentum of the Fenris Knights was overwhelming and that the forces at the outer wall could no longer hold. At this rate, the gate itself would collapse. Gritting his teeth, Lisi ordered the destruction of all mechanisms that opened and closed the gate, saying he would buy them some time. But before long, Ghislain charged straight toward him. Their blades collided with a deafening clang. Lisi barely managed to block the attack but was immediately forced backward by the sheer power behind Ghislain's strike. Their swords clashed again and again, sending sparks flying through the air. Lisi's arms began to tremble as he struggled to withstand the onslaught. He was taken aback, his breath catching as he faced Ghislain's cold, fearless gaze. Each swing from Ghislain's blade forced him back step by step until Leslie found himself nearly breathless. Still, he refused to falter. Gathering his remaining strength, he raised his sword high and declared that he was Leslie, commander of the Cavalli Knight Order, and that his opponent would not pass beyond that point. Meanwhile, in the depths of the castle, the scene shifted to the dungeon. The air there was damp and heavy, filled with the faint clinking of iron chains. Count Cavalli arrived, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. Inside one of the cells sat a man bound by numerous chains. His expression was vacant until the sound of approaching steps made him lift his head. Cavalli stopped in front of the cell and called out the man's name, Lucas. Slowly, Lucas raised his head, his sharp eyes glinting faintly in the dim torchlight. The Count spoke hurriedly, his voice trembling slightly as he urged Lucas to delay the enemy. For a moment, Lucas merely stared at him in silence, his eyes cold but tinged with dark amusement. Then, very slowly, a faint smile curved his lips. Tugging at the heavy collar around his neck, he suggested in a low, deliberate voice that the Count might loosen it for him. Cavalli hesitated. The chains rattled as Lucas's aura began to rise, a dark, oppressive energy that filled the cell with a suffocating presence. Elsewhere, Kay commanded his men to advance, ordering them to leave nothing behind, neither weapons nor people. His blade tore through the battlefield without mercy, armor splintering and shields shattering under the sheer force of his strikes. At the same time, Belinda charged toward the castle, her eyes burning with fierce determination and urgency as she sought Count Cavalli. At the castle gates, Gislin's path was blocked by the commander of the cavalry knights. The man introduced himself as Leslie, commander of the Cavalry Order, his armor gleaming beneath the fading light, his bearing calm and authoritative. He told Gislin that he would not be allowed to pass. Without hesitation, Gislin surged forward, his sword cutting a determined arc through the air. Leslie met the attack head-on, parrying with precision and countering with powerful controlled strikes. Gislin blocked each blow effortlessly, his movements fluid and sharp, like water flowing around stone. On their third exchange, Gislin brought his sword down with tremendous force, and Leslie barely managed to block it, his shield splintering under the impact. Steel clashed again and again as the two men fought relentlessly, neither yielding an inch. Each exchange grew faster and more brutal than the last. Leslie fought as though his life depended on it, determined to stop Gislin at any cost, while Gislin struck with the intent of breaking through the line to clear a path for his troops. As the battle dragged on, Leslie found it harder and harder to deflect Gislin's strikes. At one point, Gislin's sword nearly grazed his head, and though Leslie narrowly avoided it, his helmet was struck and fell to the ground with a metallic crash. Seizing the opening, Gislin swung again, landing a crushing blow against Leslie's side. Leslie raised his shield just in time, but the impact sent him stumbling backward, pain twisting his face. Seeing their commander forced back, one of the knights shouted in alarm, panic flickering in his eyes. Another rebuked him sharply, telling him that if he had time to panic, he should focus on the enemies before him instead. Leslie panted heavily, his arms trembling under the strain. He thought to himself that the last strike had been immense, nearly overwhelming his strength. But a faint sense of relief stirred within him, knowing that the blow had not been enough to break through completely. Gislin understood that if they delayed any longer, they would soon be surrounded by the cavalry's main forces. Leslie, aware of this as well, decided that instead of blocking Gislin's strikes head-on, he should deflect them at an angle to maintain distance, exploit the gaps between attacks, and seize control of the momentum. He knew that even a moment of impatience could lead to a reckless strike, and when that happened, it might very well mark Gislin's downfall. Without warning, Gislin charged toward Leslie and taunted him, questioning whether that was all he could do. Leslie barely managed to block the blow with his shield before Gislin struck him in the face with an elbow. Gritting his teeth, Leslie tried to retaliate, but Gislin leapt into the air, slashing his hand before landing gracefully and remarking that it wasn't bad. Before Leslie could process what had just happened, Gislin attacked again, this time cutting through his abdomen. As the pain overwhelmed him, Leslie recalled Count Desmond's words, how they had been told to assume this man was capable of facing even the North's greatest swordsman, Gislen Fenris. Collapsing to the ground, Leslie lay incapacitated. The cavalry soldiers, seeing their commander fall so easily, halted their fighting in shock. None of them could believe their leader had been defeated so swiftly. Gislin's knights, however, laughed at the sight of the fallen gatekeeper, praising their captain as they expected. In a serious tone, Gislin ordered his troops to maintain their momentum. His soldiers commanded the cavalry guarding the gate to open it. Leslie, addressing him as Baron Gislen Fenris, told him that things would not unfold the way he expected. One of the soldiers then reported to Gislin that the gate would not open. The mechanisms had been destroyed, making it impossible to breach. Gislin smirked slightly, acknowledging that Leslie had used his head this time. Leslie, pointing toward the distant horizon, indicated the approaching cavalry main force. He warned that no matter how strong Gislin was, once surrounded by sheer numbers, he would have no chance. If they managed to hold the gate, the cavalry would claim victory. Gislin looked out and saw the cavalry force approaching from afar, their armor gleaming under the sunlight, their horses snorting, and their hooves pounding the ground like thunder. One of his knights, addressing him as commander, asked what they should do now. Another confidently remarked that since they were knights, they should let the enemy come, declaring that if the cavalry dared approach, they would crush them. Surveying his exhausted soldiers, Gislin realized that they had used up all their mana. Everyone was drained. In their current state, they could not possibly withstand the next assault. Moving toward the gate, he placed his hand upon its cold metal surface and glanced at his sword, contemplating for a moment that perhaps he could still use it. He then ordered all his soldiers to fall back and give him space. As he stood alone before the gate, Ghislain reflected that in this era, the title of Swordmaster was more a name of honor than a defined rank, since there was no universal standard for that level of mastery. A knight's worth was measured by the recognition of his blade. Raising his sword, he began channeling an immense surge of mana. To step into the realm of a true swordmaster, one had to gather mana that sought to scatter and compress it to its utmost limit. A blinding radiance enveloped Ghislain's sword as magical energy crackled and shimmered through the air. The sight was both awe-inspiring and magnificent. The knights could not even look directly at the weapon because of its brilliance. Witnessing this display, Leslie remembered an ancient legend passed down from the Old Empire, a tale that said the defining mark of a true swordmaster was the manifestation of the aura blade. With a single motion, Ghislain struck the gate using his aura blade, fully stepping into the realm of swordmaster. At that moment, the cavalry force reached the southern gates. One of the riders shouted that they would make Ghislain pay for daring to invade the cavalry castle. Ghislain did not reply. He simply sighed, maintaining his calm composure. As the cavalry knights advanced, Ghislain suddenly arrived with his soldiers. Ghislain's horse stood beside him as fierce as ever, its nostrils flaring, eyes sharp and ready for battle. Ghislain asked Ghislain why he had brought the horse, to which Ghislain replied that it had followed them on its own. Meanwhile, the cavalry soldiers noticed that the gate had been split clean in two. In confusion, they asked their commander, John, what they should do. John quickly ordered them to retreat to the inner keep. Mounting his horse, Ghislain raised his sword high and commanded his troops to charge forward, leaving not a single enemy alive. The scene then shifted to the dungeon, where Belinda lay on the ground, her chest heaving and her breathing ragged. Despite her exhaustion, her eyes burned with unyielding determination as she glared up at Lucas, who stood looming over her. Lucas demanded to know what her connection was to the Shadow Knights. A cold wind swept through the dungeon, carrying faint echoes of the distant battle. Belinda clenched her fists silently, vowing to herself that neither defeat nor darkness would ever break her resolve.